All right, welcome back guys to our series on beta flight or firmware updating. Today we're going to be talking about getting into Boot or DFU mode. DFU stands for Device Firmware Update, and it's essentially referring to the same thing. So we're going to go ahead and plug in our Hawk Pro and update it to the latest firmware. So when we first plug it in normal mode, it'll automatically connect. And you'll see up here, you'll be able to see a couple of things. You'll be able to see the firmware version that it's on. So it's on Beta Flight 4.0, and the target, which is essentially the firmware type for the flight controller, is called Maytech F405. And that'll come in handy in just a second. Right now we're looking at the standard layout for Beta Flight. We're going to go over here to update firmware in the upper right hand corner and go ahead and click on that. And this gets us into the boot or DFU mode settings that we're going to go ahead and use. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you select the correct target. And like I showed you previously, we know that the target type for this drone is called Maytech F405. If for some reason you can't connect and see that, you can find this kind of information usually in the user manual for your flight controller, which you can download from the manufacturer's website. The next thing, once we've selected the target type, the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and choose the firmware version. So right now the board is on 4.0.0, but we're going to go ahead and choose the most recent firmware version, which is 4.1.1. So let's go ahead and select this. The next setting that you might want to configure is the reboot sequence. This you will only use if your flight controller is in boot mode. Most of the time to put your flight controller in boot mode, lately there will be a button on the side of your flight controller. For putting the drone into boot mode or DFU mode, so you can flash the firmware, the button for it is right here on right to the left of the USB slot for the flight controller, and the button is on the far side. So in order to press it, you'll just come in from the back here and hold it down. It works pretty well with tweezers. You can also take off the canopy and get at it as well, but it's right there and you just have to hold it down while you're plugging in the USB and connecting it to Beta Flight. We'll go ahead and use full chip erase, which will erase all the previous settings on the board and start from new. So next thing we're going to want to do is load the firmware. So we'll download the firmware for this board online. And once you see this release info window, you'll know that it's been downloaded. So we'll go ahead and click Flash Firmware. And we should see right here the progress bar. But it looks like it's frozen, and up here we can see this error that says failed to open serial port. So we're going to go ahead and disconnect. I'm going to go ahead and close Beta Flight and reopen it so that I can kind of start from new. And go back into this update firmware tab, and let's disconnect our drone and let's plug it in bootloader mode. What we'll do for this is we'll hold down the boot button with our tweezers and then plug in the USB, and you'll know it's worked if the LED on your flight controller stays solid blue. So now that we're in boot mode, we're going to go ahead and check no reboot sequence, which over here simply says if your flight controller is in boot mode, then use this. So we'll go ahead and enable that, and let's go ahead and try it again. I'm going to load the firmware one more time just to make sure it's ready, and then go ahead and click flash. So we're getting this failed to open serial port again. So the next step we're going to take is we're going to go to the internet, and we're going to go ahead and search Impulse RC Driver Fixer. This is a software that will help you if you're having problems with your drivers for any of your flight controller boards. We'll want to come down here to the Driver Fixer section and download the Impulse RC Driver Fixer. We'll give it a second to download and then open the executable as soon as it's done. And we'll go ahead at this point, unless you've done it already, disconnect your drone and go ahead and install that software. Once it's open, you'll see this window here where it says searching for flight controller. At this point, you'll go ahead and plug in your drone or your flight controller and give it a second to find it. Once it's worked, you'll see that it says entering bootloader, installing DFU driver, so that we can go back into the flash settings. Now that our drivers are fixed, I'm going to go ahead and close Beta Flight and reopen it. We'll go ahead and let the drone connect again, go into update firmware, and we're going to unselect no reboot sequence. We'll make sure the correct target is selected, the correct firmware version, full chip erase, load the firmware, and go ahead and hit flash firmware. and now it shows erasing, and that's what we want to see. It's erasing the previous settings on the board, and then it'll go ahead and flash with the latest flight controller version, the latest Betaflight version. So in our previous attempts, when it failed, I knew it had failed because we got an error up here that said serial port failed to open, and we also didn't see any of these progress bars down here, the flashing, the erasing, or this programming successful. But now that we do see this programming successful, it's green, then we know it has worked. So since it's worked, we'll go ahead and hit connect, and now we're connected to the board again. We'll go ahead and verify that it responds to our movements. And up here we can see that the firmware version is 4.1.1. So we know it has been successful. So just to review, to make sure if you're running into any problems you don't get stuck, what we did is we used the Impulse RC driver fixer to make sure we had the right driver downloaded, and then we plugged in the drone, clicked on update firmware. The following settings were enabled. The first 3 sections here you won't need to worry about, just leave those as they are. The next setting we checked on was the target name. So for us, we were Maytech F405. We selected the most recent version, and we deselected no reboot sequence since we didn't hold down the boot button for when we did it the last time. We used full chip erase, and we did not use a manual baud rate. Then we went ahead and loaded the firmware and flashed it. So if those things aren't working for you, you might need to hold down the boot button and as you plug it in and enable no reboot sequence, or you might need to run that Impulse RC driver fixer if you haven't already. If you've gotten your board to connect and it says Betaflight 4.1.1 or whatever version you're trying to flash up here, then you know it has been successful. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, definitely let us know, and have fun flying.